Okay, we are online. It is Thursday. What do you guys want to talk about?
What's the difference between React and React Native?
Okay, if you see my brain skipping tracks, it's getting to the question. So React and React Native, the way it got started was jQuery came out. jQuery was awesome, but it had to constantly be updating the DOM, right? So like whenever you would get data back from an API call, the jQuery would go and it would dump data into the DOM, and the DOM's not the most efficient thing in the browser, right? The browser kind of wants to render out the DOM once and be done with it. And every time you go into jQuery, it's kind of CPU and memory intensive to go find what part of the DOM you want to update and stick that data in. So this guy at Facebook came along and went, well, what if, nope, little reverb there. That's really weird that I'm getting reverb for my own speaker. Okay, so this super smart guy at Facebook came along and said, well, what if we made our own DOM? And we'll call it a virtual DOM. And it's going to be more efficient than the browser because we're going to manage the data and be able to update it on our own. And instead of having to search through the whole DOM to find the one little p tag that we want to update, we're going to keep all of the React tags in memory. And so when we go to update it, we can go to that specific one instead of having to search through the whole thing again. And people thought that was really cool. Facebook thought that was really cool. Facebook built their whole site in it. And it's all open source, right? So I'm actually a contributor to React. And all I did was there's a React text editor library, right? And they call it Quill. And Quill is what Facebook uses to, when you post a comment, it will, when you start typing someone's name, it goes, oh, do you want to tag this person? And it shows you your friend list, right? Well, there was an issue with Quill where if you paste something in, it would paste it in 2 spaces instead of just 1. It was really annoying me, and I opened up an issue on GitHub and I said, hey, this is the problem, this is how to reproduce it. And the creator of React commented back, yep, that's the problem, can you fix it? And so I'm like, oh, I don't know, I've never really looked at that code, I just use it, right? So I dove in and I saw what the issue is, and I pasted in my fix and it worked, and I submitted the pull request and they were like, yep, great. Now all of a sudden I have code that runs on, whenever you go to facebook.com, I wrote 3 lines of code that run.
Cool. Nice.
Right? Just like those little things. And so power of open source, but React kind of took off and people were like, this is cool, this makes a lot of sense. It's a much cleaner way of writing your code. It allows for more interactive web applications that feel more like a native application without having to constantly reload the page. So now to your question, what is React Native? Well, people looked at React and they're like, React is really cool, and I write all my web applications in that, but wouldn't it be nice if I could build mobile applications in that as well? And so React Native isn't for mobile websites, it's actually for mobile apps. And so what you do is React is written in a language called JSX. JSX is like if JavaScript and HTML had a baby. And so what React Native lets you do is write out all of your code in JSX, very similar to the code that you would write in React for web. And then hit this magic build button. And what React Native does is it goes in, reads all of your JSX code, and kind of spits it out in Objective-C for iOS and Java for Android. So there are 3-ish ways of building a mobile app. And I actually did a Slack post on this. And I believe I posted a link to it in CIC resources, student resources. But basically there are 3 ways of making a true app that's native, right? That you could go to the App Store and download. One of them is native code. So just write out your Java or your Objective-C. And the downside to that is you have to make 2 apps, one for Android, one for iOS. And you have to make 2 different interfaces, and they're different ways. The second way is transpiling, and React Native is the probably most popular way to transpile an app right now. Xamarin is a framework that Microsoft bought out. It is written in C# or C or .NET or some derivative of C. But basically what those apps allow you to do is write your app out once in JSX, in C, in whatever the framework is written in, and then hit the compile button, and out comes Objective-C and Java. And so your app, when it's running on the phone, has no idea that it came from JavaScript-based code, because it's actually running all the native code that Apple and Google provide to run on the app. There is a third way, and it was kind of like the grandparent to React Native, and it's called Cordova or Phonegap. And what Cordova and Phonegap are essentially a fancy web browser without the URL bar at the top. So you just build out your mobile website, and it shows up in the App Store. And all it is it's running your HTML, it's running your JavaScript, it's rendering that all out live, and it's pretending, it's kind of masquerading as a mobile app. The benefit of Cordova and Phonegap, as opposed to, say, just going to mywebsite.com in Safari on your iPhone, is that Cordova kind of makes these little holes. And it goes, well, if you would like to run native code, you can write out your native code for both iOS and Android, and then call that plugin in your own JavaScript, in your own mobile app. React Native is a totally separate project from React. It is written in the same language. It's still written in JSX. When you start writing the JSX, it will look a lot like JavaScript. But the main difference is that React Native transpiles to native code, as opposed to React, which kind of just runs regular JavaScript in the browser. Yep. I'll sit here for 3 hours if there are no questions. Just try me.
I'll keep going if
Please, I like your questions.
Do you have any recommended tutorials or resources for learning jQuery? I feel like we're probably going to run into it at some point, but I'm not sure if it's being planned to be covered in class.
Yeah. So the reason why jQuery isn't part of the curriculum is because React is the more modern version of jQuery. It's comparing React to jQuery isn't quite apples to apples. Comparing React to something like Angular might be more apples to apples. But jQuery, as much as Cordova is the grandparent to React Native, jQuery would be the grandparent to regular React for the web. It's super helpful. So the line that I draw, and not everyone will agree with me on this, but the line that I draw is that if you're making a website, and a true website, not a web app, but you just have a basic information site, there isn't much interaction between it, and users aren't going to post data to it, jQuery is still the preferred method, right? Because it's an easy library to drop in, to do some click interactions, or maybe a basic API call. You're off and running. If you're going to do more of a web application where users are entering data, they're going to save it, their API calls, there's data sitting in the front end, there's data sitting in the back end. That's when you want to get into React. I don't have any recommended tutorials on jQuery, except Free Code Camp's front end section does cover a little bit of jQuery. And it might be a good refresher to kind of dive into this stuff that you did for the first couple weeks of class to refresh there. And that is something that when I am back for the next 2 weeks of Node, if I run out of Node things to do, jQuery would be a great topic for me to do a basic covering on. Once you get the basics down though of like, hey, this is a selector, it's just basically looking through the documentation and going, okay, what am I trying to do? And then what is that method called in jQuery, right? So once you really attach it to the selector, to attach it to the figure out what DOM node you want to be working on, then it's just a matter of learning the jQuery methods in the documentation. So .html, .val, .click, all of those little shortcuts. Basically, if there is a way to write it in vanilla JavaScript, chances are jQuery has a way to write that with half the lines of code. Any questions from previous assignments? Can do one-on-one time if you guys would prefer that. If you're stuck somewhere on some homework assignment, we can go to Free Code Camp and just pick exercises. If any of those look like fun, can go over anything from this week.
Talk about Ruby on Rails.
Sure. So Ruby on Rails is a framework. It is written in Ruby, which is, so if you're doing a comparison here, Ruby is to Node as Ruby on Rails is to something like Express.
Ruby is to Node?
Ruby is to Node as Rails is to Express. So basically you have the language it's written in, Node.js, JavaScript, is similar to Ruby. Ruby is another programming language. And then Rails is your framework. So there, as frameworks go, there tend to be two kinds of frameworks. There are your lightweight frameworks that don't provide a ton of functionality. But they are, they basically just give you what you need to get started. So a lightweight framework would be like Express in JavaScript, which is what we covered this week. Other lightweight frameworks for server-side application development would be something like Flask in Python, or Sinatra in Ruby, or trying to think of other lightweight ones. There's one called Restify for Node. And then there's the other camp, which are considered full feature or more heavyweight frameworks. And these are frameworks that have a lot of features built in. It's got everything, including the kitchen sink, right? They would handle things like authorization and authentication. They would handle things like MVC, Model View Controller, which is a style for laying out your backend code. They would handle things like an ORM, an object relational mapper, which is basically connecting your database to your application backend. So those are considered more full weight frameworks. Ruby on Rails is one of them. Django is written in Python, and that would be considered more of the full weight framework. And then in Node land, the heavier frameworks would be considered Meteor.js or Sales.js.
So would you use those with Express, or do you use those instead of Express?
So you would use all of those with Node. You would use them instead of Express. So in Express land, if you want to just get a quick lightweight API up and running, but you don't want to write out all the ugly Node code, you would use Express. If you were building a full application that was going to have a ton of different endpoints and was going to connect to the database and had all of these different moving parts, and you needed to handle authentication and authorization, that's when you start going, well, I'm going to sacrifice some performance and I'm going to use something like Meteor or Sales.js if you're sticking with JavaScript, or I'm going to use something like Ruby on Rails or Django, because even though it takes a little bit more resources to run that on the server, I don't have to write out all of my login code and deal with password security and securing endpoints and all of that stuff, because that's built into the framework. So instead of having to write out hundreds of lines of code to do password security and storing that securely, I can just put a middleware function in there and just say, hey, this endpoint's only accessible to people who are signed in. And now all of a sudden that's all secured because that couple hundred lines of code was built into the framework for you. So it depends on the scope of the project. For that basic chat application, something like Meteor or Sales would be overkill. But when you start getting into it and you go, oh, well, I want multiple chat rooms, and I want the ability to sign in, and I want the ability to save my messages, and I want the ability to send pictures, and then when the app starts growing, all of a sudden you start going, well, maybe it's worth it to do a more full featured framework.
Do you know Ruby?
I do not know Ruby. So my language background, I started with PHP. And when I got started with PHP, I knew Objective-C for mobile. I knew HTML and CSS and JavaScript, but only enough JavaScript to get by making a basic website. And I knew SQL because I knew I wanted to make apps, and apps needed databases. So that was just a logical progression. And so I got really frustrated because I didn't know how to connect the database to my app. And it turned out I needed a server in between. The reason you need a server in between is because you don't want any user of your app to be able to get access to your entire database. So your web server sits in between the two of them, acts as the API, and controls access to your database. So didn't really have any mentors, didn't really know where to go. Ruby on Rails was becoming super popular back in those days. Didn't really like the syntax of Ruby. Ruby is a little bit of a backwards language. So instead of, I'm probably wrong on this, but instead of saying, for car of cars, you just say for car. That's a bad example. You basically write your loop in reverse, or you declare what your variable is going to evaluate out to, and then put equals and put the variable on the other side. It's just like they do things syntactically a little backwards. And when you read the code, it reads more like English. And some programmers argue that that is an easier way to think and write your code. Yeah. Well, it's
backwards to.
It's backwards to JavaScript.
But closer to how we talk.
Right. We don't say, when we say 1 + 1 = 2, we don't say 2 = 1 + 1.
Got it.
Right? Like those are the, so that's the basic concept of Ruby. But I got started with PHP. PHP didn't require any installation, I didn't have to get into the terminal. I just was able to put one file on my server and it magically worked for me. And I'm like, all right, I can do this. And then I started playing with frameworks. Laravel is the super popular PHP framework right now. Laravel. Back in the day when I was getting started, it was one called Cake PHP, which is still around, but Laravel tends to be the dominant one now. Couldn't stand it. It was so complicated. I was trying to learn PHP and diving into the framework without knowing PHP it was too big of a challenge for me. So I learned PHP. And then instead of, drawing a line in the sand and revisiting the framework, I kept writing PHP and kept writing PHP and kept writing PHP and ended up with this, what they call spaghetti code, where all of your code is tangled together and you can't pull it apart. And all the front end code is mixed in with all the back end code. And all the database calls are mixed right in with your forms, which are mixed right in with your styling. And so I had files that were 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 lines long of code. And you're trying to scroll through and trying to figure out what's wrong. And then you have your PHP right intermixed with your HTML, sometimes right in your JavaScript. And so that was a major mistake that I made. And after that, I progressed to Meteor.js because that was the popular thing at the time. And really liked Meteor, to this day, really like Meteor. Meteor has some scaling limitations, but I think that Meteor is a great framework for doing like hackathon projects where you have 24 hours or 48 hours and you just need to get something out. I think Meteor is great for that. Meteor is one of the only full stack frameworks. So Meteor, so if you look at something like Ruby on Rails, right? Ruby on Rails is, or Node, right, and Express, that is only on the back end. And if you would like to use a database, you can connect in MySQL, or you can connect in Mongo, or you can connect in Oracle, or whatever database you would like. And on the front end, you can use whatever front end you would like. You can use HTML and jQuery, you can use React, you can use Angular, you can use whatever front end framework you want. Meteor is a little different because it is truly full stack. So when you say Meteor is like, you're going to use Mongo and you're going to use our templating engine on the front end. And there's this called space bars or handlebars. I forget which version they use. And that's it. And if you want authentication and authorization, we got that built in. And if you want to handle data security, we got that built in. And if you would like to handle sockets and things updating automatically, we got that built in, which is great for getting started because there is a right answer, right? As opposed to when we're teaching Node, we picked React, but you could go interview and your employer might say, hey, we use Angular. And they're not wrong to use Angular, but they may have just had more developers on their team that already knew Angular, or they may have done a pros and cons of each of them and decided that Angular was the way to go, or they may have a closer tie to Google and use more Google frameworks, so that's why they picked Angular.
What's Bootstrap? Is that a
Bootstrap is a front-end framework.
front-end only framework?
It is a front-end CSS framework. So just for styling, not necessarily for interactivity. And so I forgot where I was going with that. Oh, so Meteor is a little different because they kind of shove it down your throat and they go, this is the right answer. You don't get to pick other things. This is how you use Meteor. And for a 24-hour hackathon, especially when you're just getting started, it's great to have that narrow scope and just know that there is a right answer, as opposed to kind of picking your own front-end framework, saying and going, well, I don't know, should I use React, should I use Angular, should I use jQuery? Those are all acceptable answers. So Meteor's cool. I'm a fanboy of Meteor. You will see that come out even more when I come back in 2 weeks, because that's where we will be diving in. But the kind of cool thing is we're going to do a comparison between Express and Meteor and Sales. And we're actually going to build the chat app 2 more times. So we're going to build the chat app again in Meteor, and then we're going to build the chat app again in Sales. And the reason for doing that is we're going to see Sales is more of a conventional MVC, model view controller. The model is kind of your database, right? And the model defines how you structure the data in your database. Then you have your controller, which is what we kind of did in our Express file, right? It sits between the model and the view. And the controller is what maybe does your authorization and authentication. It does some data validation. It's kind of the middleman, right? That's your server. And then we have the view, and your view is obviously what gets displayed. That's your HTML. That might be a templating language like EJS. And that's kind of the conventional way of splitting up your code server side. Ruby on Rails and Sales.js and Django all use MVC. So that's why we're going to cover that, because there's a good chance that if you get a full stack job, one of your interview questions will be, what's MVC? Why do you use it? What is an M? What is a V? And what is a C? But there are also more modern ways of writing your code. React has kind of changed the game a little bit and has taken a lot of the controller aspects that you would typically do server side and shifted that to the front end. So React can fit into the MVC architecture. And then there are things that are kind of shaking up the whole game and going like Meteor, where it's full stack, right? So because Meteor controls every aspect of the stack, they can break convention and they can shake things up a little bit. I have no idea what the original question was. Nor do I know if I answered it. So if anyone knows what the original question was and I didn't answer it, feel free to ask it again. Or ask another question.
Can I ask you a different question?
Sure.
Okay, so question about JSON objects.
Mm-hmm.
So I've heard that JSON objects are language agnostic, and that you can use them with C or other different languages. And
Yes.
each language has its own way of parsing or stringify,
Yes.
like its own method to do that. Who decided to use JSON objects as a way to communicate? Is there just like some big internet committee somewhere that's just like, oh, this is it?
Yeah, so the main reason why JSON is used is because it's not necessarily about the language that is sending the data. It is more about the language that is receiving the data, right? So you have Ruby on Rails, you have with Ruby, you have Django with Python, you have PHP and Laravel, and all of those languages are great, and they all store their data server side in a slightly different syntax, right? But at the end of the day, they need to send their data where? They need to send their data to the browser, right? And when you look at all the browsers way back in 1989, 1992, whenever JavaScript came out, that was Netscape was like, okay, we have HTML and HTML is great. CSS didn't even exist, but they were like, we need a language that our browser is going to run that will allow for interactivity, that will allow that HTML to get updated after the HTML is loaded. And so Brendan Ehrlich came up with JavaScript, and the story goes that he did it in like a 2-week period from no language whatsoever. He built JavaScript from scratch. And so JSON kind of became the standard for all those other backend languages because it was always getting ingested by JavaScript. And so now when you send data back and forth between servers, JavaScript is also the preferred method, because when you build an API and you're consuming or you're using that API in your website, chances are you're using that in JavaScript. So that's why JSON came out. JSON is an agreed upon standard. There is a something called RFC, request for RFC, request for comments, which is organized by a committee called the IETF. And the IETF is the Internet Engineering Task Force. The IETF works alongside ICANN, which is another standards body. W3C is another one, and IEEE, along with IANA. Those are the major, I want to say the major 5 that kind of keep the internet running behind the scenes. ICANN is responsible for the DNS system, I believe, and the DNS system is what makes your computer know that google.com actually equals 1.2.3.4 or whatever it is. But these are all agreed upon standards, and one of these bodies, I believe it's W3C, is also responsible for the ES standards, the ECMAScript standards, also known as JavaScript. Not legally, but who do you don't go around going, oh, I know ECMAScript. You go around saying, I know JavaScript. And so those are all standards that are agreed upon. They put out these RFCs, literally requests for comments, and they go, please comment on this if you have feedback on this, if you would like something changed, if you don't agree with this standard. And someone might come out and go, you can't change that parameter. It's going to break thousands of websites because all those websites use that parameter. Here's another way to write it, or another way to add it in, or maybe a new name for it. And so these standards come up and then are released, and then browsers go about adopting them. But JSON is organized by one of these 5-ish bodies, and they kind of agree upon that standard. And the reason why JSON became popular, XML came before it. XML looks just like HTML. They're opening tags and closing tags. The issue that they ran into with XML is, well, when you have an opening tag and a closing tag, you're now doubling the amount of data, as opposed to JSON, which just has your key and your object. So JSON files tend to be smaller when you're talking about thousands or millions of lines of data. So XML used to be the go-to, and then JavaScript started getting popular. People started using JSON, and because every browser runs JavaScript, JSON kind of took off.
So when we did our spreadsheet, you said that JavaScript and Python were, in my mind, competitors, sort of. I mean, do they do the same things? Like, you said that they were both back-end languages.
Yeah, so JavaScript is kind of like, you got to put a giant asterisk on JavaScript whenever you try and compare it to something, because JavaScript is somewhat unique in that it runs everywhere. It runs in the browser, it runs on the server, and it didn't always used to be that way. So go back 15 years ago and JavaScript was only used in the browser. And if you said to someone, well, what if we use that server side? They laugh at you and they go, oh, well, it's not fast enough. JavaScript's just for updating your HTML. Why would you want to use JavaScript? Like, that's silly. And then Node came out, and Node really changed the game, because you can use your JavaScript in the back end. JavaScript obviously can be used server side, and that's what we're doing with Node. And Python is conventionally used server side. And if you talk about Python in the scope of web development, then yes, 100% Python is a server-side programming language, right? It's not used in the browser. Python is a scripting language,
Mhm.
which means that you can actually build a Python script that runs right in your terminal that doesn't connect to the internet. And you can use Python to program. Python is now replacing Java in a lot of colleges as a beginner programming language because it's much easier to read than JavaScript, and it doesn't have as much syntax. So there are less brackets, there are less curly braces, there are no semicolons at the end of lines. You can almost pick up Python and read it and kind of get what it's supposed to do. As opposed to JavaScript, where you're going, I don't know what that does, right? Or so when you're talking about web development, Python is used server side, and JavaScript can be used server side with Node, or it can be used in the browser with JavaScript. When you get outside of that and you're just straight up comparing programming languages, Python can theoretically be used and often is for scripts for just, hey, I got a little LED and I want to learn how to make it flash on and off. Python is a commonly used programming language to do that. As compared to something like PHP, which is strictly used server side. No one writes PHP code for anything other than running it on a server.
Yeah, what is that?
PHP, again, can be compared to Python server side. It can be compared to Node. It is just another programming language. And the good news is once you've really mastered one of them, and by master, I mean use it for 2 or 3 years, it is pretty easy to jump in between them. So, as a junior developer, if you're applying for a job and they go, oh, we only use Python, and you go, well, I have JavaScript experience, the employer may be a little hesitant to hire you. But once you get up to the senior level and you go, oh, I've been programming in JavaScript for the past 5 years, and I kind of know all the ins and outs of it, and I've been doing full stack JavaScript, they would look at you and kind of be like, oh, well, we use Python, you can jump over to that, right? Because at the end of the day, every programming language has for loops. Every programming language has arrays and objects. In Python, they're called lists. How does a list compare to an array? It's exactly the same thing, right? Just called something different. In Python, it might not be called push, right? You might call .add instead or something like that. But at the end of the day, if you're doing full stack development, there are API endpoints, and the data's got to get sent back, and there's got to be a database connection, right? And whether you write that database connection in Python and Django, or you write that in Node with Express, at the end of the day, it's accomplishing the same thing. So your core programming concepts are always going to be the same across any programming language. The category is the most important thing. So, okay, backend. So I know Node is going to compare to Python or Ruby. But framework-wise, Express is going to compare to Rails or Django. Or front end, okay, jQuery is going to compare to React or Angular.
I have a more general, like not necessarily technical question.
Sure.
So one of the things that interested me about learning more about coding was just the idea of these big data sets that are available for analysis. I don't quite yet, I mean, I know we're going to talk about databases next week, but just generally speaking, what do you do? Because my daughter took a computational forensics class, and she was learning Python, and they were scraping data sets. So could you just just walk through like how you would do that, like not technically, but just what's available or
so
there are for that?
I can talk about a project I worked on. So the Onondaga County has all the tax records available. right? And you can go in, you can search by address, you can see the valuation of the house, you can see what year it was built, you can see the amount of school taxes, the amount of county taxes, all of that stuff.
But not who's about to be foreclosed from have back taxes. They won't let you do that unless you know, but keep going.
Yeah, there's some greased palms going on with
Just goes to the
foreclosures.
land bank and no one gets to know until September, but why?
Right.
But anyway, all that information takes sense.
So that is all powered by a database, right? They have some database. We don't know what kind of database it is. It could be using Mongo, but let's be honest, it's the government, so it's not Mongo. It's probably MySQL or something older like Oracle, MS SQL, anything like that. That's all sitting in a database. And if I had access to that database, I could write a query, right? So I could say, hey, search for all the properties in North Syracuse, and I can see that there are 10,000 of them or whatever. But we don't get access to that database.
Mm-hmm.
We get a web interface and we can search for things. But what if I want to dive into that a little bit more? What if I want to say, what's the average cost of a house in North Syracuse? I don't have access to that because their interface doesn't give me access to query that way or write my own custom query. So what I would do is I would write a scraper, and a scraper is basically a bot, right? It's a loop that's going to load up every single page on that website, click on it, get the data, and copy it into my own JavaScript object. And it's going to go through and it's going to click on every single link on that page, and it's going to open every page. It's going to read through the website. It's going to pull the data off of it, and it's going to store it in a format that I can then go work with it. Now, there are some websites that have open data sets, right? The city just opened up like the snowplow data, right? So they were like, look, we have all this data and we have a crappy website to show it all. So if you would like to use it, just hit the download button. That's great. And a lot of cities are doing that because developers are now coming out, going to events like Hack Upstate and building really cool apps with those data sets. But when that data isn't available, sometimes you need to write a scraper to go through and pull that data out, because I can see it on my computer and I can hit the next button and see the next property and see that data. There's got to be a way to tell the computer, hey, go through this for all 10,000 properties and pull that data out for us. So that's when you would write a scraper. There are some questions of legality on a scraper.
That was my next question, yeah.
It is a gray area of the law, because the argument can be made that, well, I can sit on my computer and spend 10 weeks just hitting the next button and copying and pasting that information, and that's not illegal. So why should it be illegal for a bot to go through and do that?
Sure.
Right. Then you get into the whole fair use category of, well, it's public information with an asterisk. It's public information for you to look up your own property. It's not public information for you to get all 10,000 properties.
With scraper, could you recreate the database once you extract
Yes.
it all
And that's
and make it open source? Or is that the legal?
now you're in the legal aspects of it of, okay, well,
If you scrape some of theirs and some other stuff.
not a lawyer, not
Yeah,
claiming
no,
to be
it's-
one, being recorded right now.
No.
So, no, it's completely.
Not Ruby.
I'm qualified to give legal advice.
But it is not technically illegal to scrape it. It's a gray area. The legality, as I understand it, comes down to what you do with that data. So it might not be illegal to scrape the data. It might be illegal to go ahead and republish that data, or it might be illegal to scrape all that data and then use it for marketing reasons, right? Google has some pretty strict rules about you can't scrape their data. They want you to use their API, and their API is great, super easy to use. All of that's fantastic. But you have to pay for it at a certain threshold, right? You get a certain number of free searches, and then after that, you have to pay. And the reason for that is they argue that's intellectual property, right? They spend millions or billions of dollars scraping the internet, pulling those resources together and making it so that when I search for music, MySpace and Apple Music and Spotify and all of those come up, right? And so there is definitely legality around it. But a scraper would be used when you go, okay, I see this data set and I would like to use that, but they have a web interface around it where I can't easily do what I want with that data. So you could pull that data and then go ahead and use it however you wanted if you scraped it. And Python, again, one of those languages that doesn't have anything to do really, it's a scripting language. So you're using Python to go load up a web page, pull the data off the web page, store it in whatever format. Normally it's a CSV, right? Like an Excel file. And then you can use Python again to do some data analytics on it and go, okay, load the house value for all 10,000 properties and then average them out. Or, you can get in and do some scripting with that.
So the Python would be used to analyze the data.
Or to retrieve the data through the web scraper.
Or JavaScript.
JavaScript has web scrapers available, and JavaScript, you could do the data analytics right in that if you wanted to, yes.
All right. And
there are often ports, by the way. So Scrapey is a popular Python scraping package and framework. And people are like, that's awesome, but I know JavaScript, I want to do this in JavaScript. So there are ports where people go, Scrapey's awesome, and we like the whole way it's laid out, we like all the methods of it, and it's all open source, but I want to remake all of that in JavaScript. So someone does that, they call it something else, and they'll flat out accredit Scrapey and go, I built this off of Scrapey, or I modeled this after Scrapey.
And who does that kind of work?
So if you look in the case of React, it's all open source. There was some guy at Facebook who thought he could make a package that would make.
No, I mean the data gathering and interpretation
or
analysis.
Developers.
Oh yeah. Okay.
If you get to a big enough company, the data guys are different from the developers, right? And they're more mathematically trained and more statistics based. Sometimes they will work together with the developers and go, hey, this is the data that I would like, or this is what I would like to collect. Can you change the code or write some code to do that and then give it to me and I'll go off my own little world. I'm blanking on the language all the statisticians use. R, they use R, which is a derivative of Python, I believe. And they also use MATLAB a lot, which is essentially a programming language for mathematicians.
Wasn't there just something in the news about MATLAB?
MATLAB, MATLAB. Probably.
I think it was something like in the last couple of days.
So yeah, lots of different languages. Some of them are purpose-built, like R for data analytics. Some of them, I don't know if R is a language or a framework. R is a programming language. Okay.
Wait, seriously, is it really?
A free software environment for statistical computing and graphics.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely a programming language. People who like R, like Python, there's a big overlap there. It looks like R is built primarily in C and C++. But R is for all the stats nerds out there who need an actual programming language, they go to R.
Why is it too huge?
Pretty cool.
More questions?
I have one that's still not technical. Are data science degrees worth it? And this is more for my daughter than me. I'll take my answer off.
So everyone's going to have a different answer on this. A college professor is obviously going to tell you something different. Data science is a growing field. Data science isn't quite computer science, but the two are definitely parallel. I would encourage anyone who's pursuing data science to also have a background in computer science, because an employer is going to find you 10 times more valuable when you can not only analyze the data, but also tell the computer how to analyze the data. So data science is definitely a growing field. I have nothing against it. The underlying question, which I have to bite my tongue on that, is a college degree worth it? And that's a whole nother can of worms of, well, there's so much more to college than just what they teach. My bigger issue is that colleges tend to not be like boot camps, where when you go to get a CS degree, they're teaching you one programming language. They're not teaching you server-side development and front-end development and databases and how to connect it all together. They're teaching you the computer science, the science aspect of it, and how to assign things in memory. And there's a big debate right now on whether you're a software engineer or a software developer. The easy line in the sand is, oh, well, you're an engineer if you write algorithms or you do optimization, but you're a developer if you kind of just wire things up together. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that definition. And I think that a lot of companies are struggling with that right now, where they go, oh, we want an engineer. And they hire an engineer, and the engineer comes in and goes, I can optimize all of this. I can make all of this faster for you. And they go, that's great. We need a new app. And they go, I don't know how to make an app. I don't know how to connect a server to a database and all that, but I can write a really cool algorithm for you. And this is something that's coming up in interviews a lot as well. Is, okay, if I'm interviewing for a position, it's an easy interview test to say, hey, go write this algorithm. It's a much harder interview test to say, hey, go spin up a new server and do a whole API call. And so that goes back and forth on, well, do you really need an engineer, or do you need a developer who can write basic algorithms? Yeah.
It's also been reading about this because I am in this little group that is looking for enzymes that will crack into bacteria, like TB. They haven't figured that out yet. And they like data scientists, sorry, take them, to know what you just said, the actual
Basic computer science,
stuff,
right?
but also a data scientist, an effective one would have another, I would need to know the enzymes that would work.
Yeah.
To pull out of, I would have to have, protein structure in the specific, just a field of knowledge, maybe not separate from, but in addition to the tech, all the tech, I think.
Because in my experience, when I
For
was in
data,
school,
to be a decent, what are you gonna be a data scientist about?
Right.
What data, and do you know your data? Is your data proteins? Do you know anything about proteins? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
Okay.
in that particular, example, but it used to be the econ department had econometrics department, and that was where you went if you wanted to study statistics. But now data science, I know it's kind of a buzzy thing.
Well, and you can be a statistician and, you know, and be in the math department, or you can, there are a lot of different areas that you can focus on. They say the big thing is big data, right? Big data was a buzzword like 2 years ago. And big data is great, but what's important is information, right? Because you can look at your data set and it's great that you have 1 million rows of data, but what does that actually mean? And that's when it takes not only the data scientist to go through and say, okay, I know what to look for in that data, but it would also take a programmer to say, okay, tell me what you're looking for in that data, and I will write a program that will find that for you.
Right.
And so that's why there's a big crossover between those two fields. Other questions?
Open source.
So open source is, GitHub is most commonly associated with open source. Open source tends to be free software that has a license associated with it that basically says that you're allowed to reuse our code. The thing with open source is it isn't just free or someone else's code you can use, but it's a community. So you will also you will hear OSS or OSC, open source community, a lot, where not only do they share all their code with you and you can go use their code, but if there is something that you would like their code to do, if there is something you would like their code to do and you or their code is broken, you have access to all their code. So it wasn't like you just installed it and used it. You can see everything that's running. So GitHub, which is now owned by Microsoft, has GitHub issues where you can go and say, hey, I thought this was going to work. It doesn't. I made it work. I edited your code. If you would like to use this, you can. So Kate, to answer your question, a span is like a div, except that it is inlined. So when you write out something, when you do a p tag, right, or a div, they are block elements. So it's going to automatically be on the next line. When you do a span, it's like an inline p tag. So basically you can put things right next to each other without having to float two divs or p tags next to each other. As for the free code camp and job interview question section, pick an exercise you want me to do and I will share my screen and do it in front of everyone. And that goes for you guys as well. If you see something on free code camp that you're like, ooh, that would be fun to do, I can dive in and do that.
I don't know if I've ever looked at free code camp and said, ooh, that looks like so much fun. Just me, though. I mean, I've been challenged. Don't get me wrong.
They're good.
Challenge.
There are times that I will go into free code camp and go, like, it's a good refresher even for me.
I can imagine that, yeah. And I had actually stopped looking at it after we finished JavaScript, and they have all this stuff on here. Well, if we're gonna do free code camp, I'd be kind of interested in the regular expressions, just because I don't really remember much about why. Is that a big deal? I mean, I don't know anything about it. We did talk about it very briefly.
Regular expressions. Woohoo! All right.
Should I just blow it? I don't know. What's very
My job title could be professional regex.
Oh,
expression writer. So basically, to give you some context on why we use regular expressions, we have our content management system and our that we build internally. And the what makes us different is that we have different bits, and those bits have rules associated with them. So depending on what is true, we take that bit and insert the content that has the true rule into that bit.
Okay.
Well, in addition to bits, we have different links that can link you to other elements. So basically, we have this whole hierarchical structure, but it has to replace all the content. So at the end of the day, it's just a paragraph. So I write regex expressions all the time. So let's see what Free Code Camp has in store for us.
I mean, I remember when Jake talked
Mhm.
about them. Yeah.
Where did you see them? Oh,
They're in
got it.
I
Okay.
don't remember what we did with them. I don't really remember.
Okay, so basically the whole point of regex is to take out a part of the string, is to find a certain part of the string and take it out. So in our basic regex, what they're basically doing here is they're saying we should regexes are defined with slashes, right? So a slash on either side. And what they're saying we can do here is my regex.test, my string. And if we run these tests, we got it. Okay. So basically what it's doing is, let's console log out our result, and we see true. So what test does is it says, hey, look for this word hello in the string hello world. And so that can be a little tough to see. So I use a website called regexpal.com. There are 1,000 gazillion of these. But what it allows you to do is put in your test string and then put in your regular expression. And what it's going to do is it's going to highlight the part that matches for you. So if we delete out the O in our regular expression, it's going to show you what it matches. Or if we put a comma in our regular expression, it's going to show that as well. So this is just a basic string to get started, right? And all we're doing is we're saying, hey, does hello world include the word hello? Does it include this pattern? And if it does, return true, or console log out result. Okay, so that's the basics.
Okay.
So now what we're going to do is regex is case sensitive, right? So if we what they want us to do is find Waldo, but it should not search for anything else. So in our search here, we are going to type in Waldo. And if we run that, we get it. But if we change this to a lowercase w, which is the whole point of this exercise, it will show you that it did not find Waldo because it is case sensitive. So there are a lot of rules with regex. You can do ORs, you can do wildcards, you can do matches inside of strings. So basically what they're saying here is it wants result to be true if the string has a type of pet in it. So what we can do is we can write up here dog and then use the or operator and say cat or bird or fish.
Okay.
And then we can run those tests and we get it. So basically what this is saying is if this string has any of these words in it, then return true. So then you can get in here and say, okay, if the, what if we want to just test to see if our string has a word in it, but we don't care about the case. So free code camp will match, but free code camp will match, or free code camp will match. We can say free code camp in here, but then do a case insensitive option right after the slash called an I, or just putting in the I. And if we run that, we get it. So if you go through all these exercises, they will start, they will teach you all the basics of regular expressions. But basically what you want to keep in mind with a regular expression is that they are used for seeing if one string, a big string, contains a smaller subset, and if it does, matching them out. They're a little bit of a subset of programming, but almost every programming language, kind of like JSON, uses regular expressions. There's subtle differences between some of them, but it's a pretty common thing to say, hey, I need to know if this string contains this thing in it. A very common use of them would be, did you enter a valid email address? Okay, well, an email address, you would go, okay, well, it has to have a letter at the beginning, but it can have multiple letters at the beginning. It needs to have an @ sign. It can have one letter following that, but it needs to have at least one letter following that. And then it needs to have a dot, and then it needs to have another letter following that. But you can get really fancy with regexes and say, well, that dot needs to be at least one letter, but less than 10 letters. Right? Or you can get in there and go, oh, well, you know what? It's not valid to have this special character anywhere in the email address, so validate that out. But the reason you would want to do a regex is if someone's signing up for your website and, you know, they just, you prompt for an email address and they just type in test and hit send or sign up or whatever, you don't want your website to allow that to go through. Or password requirements. You want the password to be a certain number of digits, but you might not want it to have an emoji character in it. So those are all reasons you would want to use a regex.
I mean, isn't that basically what you're doing whenever you search something, search for some article? Or I remember in the early days, this would be completely different now, but in the early days of like legal research by a computer, you would put in a phrase or two phrases and you would say within 20 words of each other.
Yep.
It might be better now. I'm sure it's better now, but
yeah, so it would be similar. Regex is a syntax you use for searching strings for other strings.
okay.
Yeah. If you can find a thermostat, you can adjust it.
Not cold enough yet.
On 15 minutes, and then we'll take a break. More questions? Any questions about assignments? That goes for the people joining in remotely. If anyone has questions, feel free to ask them on Slack or join the Zoom room. No one has questions. I will break out to one-on-ones. I'd like to kind of do a touch base with everyone and see where they're at, how they're feeling, what they need more attention on, check based on your capstone. If you are joining the live stream remotely and you're a careers and code student, please DM me on Slack just so I know you're around. And I'll probably give you a Slack call just to touch base with everyone. Okay, I guess I will mute the live stream for now. If anyone has questions, post them in Slack or just throw them out in the Zoom room, and I'll leave that that open in case anything comes up that would be good for the whole class to hear.